I'm not going to introduce our panel as they're miking up, but I will introduce our moderator, whose voice is as synonymous and commonplace as the sounds of an Aspen morning. I was at a party in Washington, D.C. with a friend, and he turned to me and he looked across the room and he grabbed me and he said, "Look, there's Bill Clinton." And I said, "Shh, I think I hear another voice. I think it's Linda Wertheimer." We're very pleased to have her moderating this session. She's been with NPR for over 3 decades, and she has a wonderful way of taking us right to the heart of the issues that matter most. And this morning, as we focus on the American criminal justice system with our distinguished panelists, I expect no less. Please give me and join me in welcoming our panelists and Linda Wertheimer.
Thank you all very much. We're going to have a discussion about the American criminal justice system. So there are obviously a lot of things that we will be talking about. Some of the questions that the people up here on this panel think are important, and then we will want to spend some time at the end of the session finding out whether we've talked about all the things that you think are important. So there will be a period for questions and answers, not speeches, we hope, but, but questions. But we have a very distinguished group of people here today to help us with this in this effort. And I'm going to go first to Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who has retired, as you know, in 2006 from the court. She was appointed by President Ronald Reagan to keep a campaign promise. And she replaced Justice Potter Stewart, and then was replaced in 2006 by Justice Sam Alito. She is a Stanford grad. We have a couple of those up here. And that is where she met her husband, John, and also where she met the future Chief Justice of the United States, William Rehnquist. And I think it's certainly worth mentioning that Arizona State changed the name of its law school to the Sandra Day O'Connor School of Law.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that we know about her from the session yesterday is that she considers herself an unemployed cowgirl. I would like to also say that she is a member of the Cowgirl Hall of Fame. We also have with us, you're getting low billing here because I'm going
entirely appropriate. It always
to the
happens.
High Court, and then to the man of God. Bishop D. Jakes is, as you know, a television evangelist, but before he became a television evangelist, he started his own church at the age of 22. He was able to go on television a few years later. You were by that time the ripe old age of 38, I believe.
That's right.
But he has his church, the Potter's House in South Dallas, has 30,000 members. I mean, and that's big even in a city where extraordinarily large churches abound, and where nearly everybody goes to church, I might add. Potter's House has among its many activities a prison ministry, in which the bishop is active. He has worked. He and his parishioners have worked on hurricane relief, orphanages in South Africa. He offers financial advice to his flock. He has written more than 30 books, including some of what publishers call novels. I would say they're probably more like parables, 2 of which have been made into movies. He talks, when he talks about the justice system and the large numbers of people who are incarcerated, about the need to rescue those hidden deposits of greatness that are covered over by violence and criminal records. So this is something that is a tremendous interest to him and also to Charles Ogletree, who is a professor at Harvard University. He is the James Klemenko, is that his?
Jesse Klemenko.
The Jesse Klemenko, I beg your pardon, professor of law at Harvard, and the founder of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice at Harvard. Charles Hamilton Houston, as most of you probably know, is sort of casually known as the man who killed Jim Crow. He was the litigation director of the NAACP. He trained Thurgood Marshall. He was responsible for just about every, he was involved in just about every civil rights lawsuit from the early 30s to Brown v. Board. And Charles Ogletree founded the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute at Harvard. He's a Stanford graduate, Harvard Law School graduate, sort of polished his techniques as a public defender in Washington, D.C., and ultimately moved up into the leadership of the Public Defender's Office. He has written a number of books, and he has appeared on television lots and lots of times, on radio too, I might add, both as a moderator and narrator of documentaries and as a source. He is interested in, among other things, he is interested himself in one of the last confirmation hearings we had for the Supreme Court. He was involved, he was counsel to Anita Hill in the confirmation of Clarence Thomas to be Justice of the United States. So this is a very distinguished group of people we have to talk to us today. And we're going to be talking about justice, and I wanted to ask you, first of all, just because I know there are a lot of things we're going to be talking about that have to do with crime and injustice. So I'd like to ask first, what do you think the American justice system does right? Justice O'Connor?
Does a lot of things right. We're fortunate here because we do have a very strong right to jury trial. And if you have a fairly selected jury, I think it's a great assurance to the defendant, if the defendant decides to go to trial, that it can be heard in an appropriate manner. So you can't, I think, criticize that too much. There have been a lot of cases dealing with exclusion, for instance, of African Americans from juries when there's an African American on trial. And I think the courts have dealt pretty well with that and have tried to prevent that from happening. So I think that works quite well. And that would be the major thing. We have a decent appellate system in the United States. And criminal defendants who are convicted have an opportunity to appeal if they're convicted in state court through the state court system. And then they still have a right for some kind of review in the federal courts after all that's over. So that's pretty impressive if you review it comparatively with other nations.
Bishop Jakes, I know that you have, in addition to dealing with people who are incarcerated, that you have reserved a lot of your activism for people who are the victims of crime, especially women who've been mistreated.
Well, from our perspective, I think it's very, very important that we go beyond the justice that is executed through a trial to understanding the nuances of the victim, to be a voice and advocate for that victim, and to be a soft place for them to fall and to reevaluate their lives in the light of the tragedies that they've incurred, whether they are victims of violent crimes or their children or what have you have been victims of violent crimes. We become a counseling place to let their voice be heard.
Do you think, do you think that that is one of the things that works with the American justice system, that justice for victims?
I think it's very, very important. I think it's critical that that voice be heard, and it goes beyond just justice and the adjudication of legalism to understanding that justice is not totally ratified at the end of the trial, because often the victim continues to suffer. Even though the perpetrator has been penalized, there is a suffering that goes beyond justice, as we see in the court system, to the resolution of the discomfort and the adversity that comes not only to the individual that is in the spotlight, but to the periphery of the family, the children, and the whole environment suffers unfairly. And there is an opportunity for us to work together with the judicial system to do those things that the courts cannot do in bringing about a peaceful resolve and recalibrating who that person is after the adversity is over.
Well, Reverend Jakes is doing a good job with that, and it is clearly a problem. I don't think every state has resources to do that. He has set up a good program, but I don't think it's universal.
No, it's not, but it can be. And that's one of the things that draws attention to this discussion for me that made it important, because I think it's something that we need to arm ourselves with the responsibility of making sure that the person assimilates back into society effectively.
Professor Ogletree.
Well, there are a lot of great things about the justice system. The list of bad things is longer, but let me talk about some of the good things that are happening. Justice O'Connor talked about the right to a jury trial, which is fundamental, but it has been denied far too often to women and people of African descent and Latinos, even though the court has pushed it. The same thing, the idea of having a lawyer in a criminal case, was part of I think one of the remarkable things from the Warren Court. We criticize the Warren Court, but that's the court that said, you know what, you should have a lawyer if you're going to be facing a prosecutor. You might go to jail for life. You should have a lawyer. It's that same court that also said that you can't force confessions from people, even if they're guilty. If there's a certain process, you need to have a right to a lawyer. You need to waive your rights to testify, and I think it's very important. One of Justice O'Connor's former colleagues, Justice Scalia, has been a surprising voice of clarity on the Sixth Amendment right of confrontation, that it means something. That if someone's going to accuse you, you have a right to confront that witness and that evidence, which sometimes goes against victims' rights, but the idea is that if someone's going to accuse you, they must show up, or they must be subject to cross-examination. That's very important. And three amazing things by what some conservatives call liberal. He's a moderate Republican. Justice Kennedy, since his service, has done an enormous amount on justice. He wrote the majority opinion saying that 18-year-olds cannot be executed anymore in the United States. He's the one who is very important in the decision to say that the mentally retarded can't be executed. He's the one that people's sexual orientation can't be a basis to violate their privacy rights. If it's a penalty for women and men to do something, it can't, not a penalty, it can't be a penalty for men and men or women and women to do the same thing. The idea that a court has moved beyond the strictures of the old views of the system makes a big difference. So there are a number of great things that I think the system is doing now, and I just hope that it continues.
But one of the things that you've written a lot about and talked a lot about is that this same justice system imprisons an extraordinarily large number of people, first of all. An extraordinarily large number of those people are minorities. And why does that happen? Why is prosecution, is that injustice?
It is, and I'm not blaming a particular prosecutor. I think we have a flaw in our system of punishment, and we'll be hearing more about this when Justice Breyer does a panel later this week, but the idea is that this is an adversary system. In some senses, if one side of the adversarial system is handcuffed or doesn't have the resources, then you don't get a just result. And we have far too many people in prison in this society. We have over 2 million, and half of them are African Americans. Many of them are men, and many of them from nonviolent drug offenses. And children as well. There's a problem with the justice system as well. We have a report at the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute. Our website is charleshamiltonhouston.org. It says no more children left behind bars because too many of our children have been denied basic rights. I also just testified 2 weeks ago in support of a surprising, non-controversial congressional effort to promote justice. This is Senator Jim Webb, who is no easy person on criminal justice, who's very tough, who believes people should be punished and victims should be supported, but he says there are too many people in jail. We don't have a real reentry program for people who should be released. And his Criminal Justice Commission Act of 2009 is the most refreshing idea I've heard in a long time, that let's step back and try to fix the system because we all have some personal responsibility in where it is now. And so I think those are examples of flaws in the system, but I'm very optimistic. And it's not the court. We put too much burden on the court. The legislative branch and the executive branch take responsibility and must take responsibility to solve some of these problems.
That's important because what's happened nationwide and through the states initially, and then also the federal government, is to start enacting mandatory minimum sentences. I used to be a trial judge in the state of Arizona, and when I had a felony case, my jurisdiction gave me the right to punish the defendant if it were a guilty verdict with anything from probation to life imprisonment. Well, that changed, and starting about 1980s, legislatures began enacting mandatory minimum sentencing, and they did it initially in drug cases. They were upset about drug use, and they thought, aha, the thing to do is to make sure that anybody caught with drugs that could be sold ought to get 20 years minimum in prison. No excuse, no difference. Well, it has resulted in these huge numbers of people in prison. If you compare the percentage of our citizens who are in prison today with those of other Western nations, I mean, we lead by 80% or more. It's just staggering.
It's something like 1 in 100.
Yeah, well, it's amazing. And these are primarily drug cases. These tend not to be violent crimes, but they're crimes of some kind of drugs that might be for sale. I mean, that's predominantly it. And we just have to make a decision in this country whether we want to continue that pattern or not. Other nations are not doing that. And I don't advocate making drug use legal, but I do advocate examining our system to see if we need these long mandatory minimum sentences.
And added to that, then you have 3 strikes. 3 strikes laws now in what, 24 states, something like that?
Yes, and it's not just 3 strikes. There's sometimes it's 2 strikes. I mean, the fact that you get 80 years or 100 years in prison, but not life. I don't know how many people are going to live through 80 years or 100 years in prison, as opposed to the 3rd strike when you get life imprisonment. So it's a failed system. But Justice O'Connor, again, I think this touches upon an issue that has nothing to do with the courts primarily, but with our legislative and executive branches. The idea in the 80s was to punish drug users. And it started from the most inauspicious point, and people forget this. A great hero of mine, the great Speaker of the House, Chip O'Neill, was heartbroken when Len Bias, an African-American player at the University of Maryland, was selected by the Celtics. He was about to start, and he ingested too much cocaine and died of powder cocaine. We were outraged. We had to do something about drugs. So not powder cocaine, but crack cocaine became the conduit. And as a result of that, Congress passed a law saying that the penalties for crack cocaine would be 100 times more than crack cocaine. Court couldn't do anything about that. That was the law. And in fact, today, thank God, Congress is saying, and the President Barack Obama has said, and the Attorney General said, 1-to-1. Powder and crack cocaine have no pharmacological differences. They must be punished the same. That will transform the system and eliminate this disparity based on race and treat people very evenly. And I think that's an important step in the right direction.
You've been working with just that problem.
I think it's a huge problem. It's a huge disparity, and it has racial undertones to it that has been detrimental to the African American community and Hispanics and others. The other thing that I think is important to note, while the notion was originally thought that tougher laws like this on drugs would diminish drug use, time has proven that that is not true. It's not just that we're overpopulating our prisons by the existence of these laws, but it is also ineffective in the street in diminishing drug use and substance abuse. And it is frustrating that there are disparities between crack and cocaine. I'm pleased to find out that those disparities are being rectified. Often, depending on which side of the tracks you live, if you have a drug problem, it's treated as a disease. If you move to the other side of the tracks and you have a drug problem, it's treated as a crime. And we need to change, I think, sociologically and maybe psychologically how we view and even how the media presents these people. Because in many cases, we will present them, oh, this person has a problem and they need treatment. And it's based on their affluence or their race or their money. And then the same person has a problem who is a minority, and we present them as a criminal. And so I think it has a lot to do with how Americans see people, and it has something to do with us reevaluating the fact that what we have done 20 years ago does not work. We've had time to see it. It has overpopulated our prisons, and it has not been effective in diminishing drug abuse.
It certainly is it became a tremendous political cause that lots of people ran on reducing crime.
Get tough on crime, and particularly drug crime. Interestingly, today, many states have big deficits between income and their budgeted expenses. And part of that expense is running prisons. And now we're seeing a little pressure on the other side to try to reduce the expenses of prisons, which might mean not having as many people in prison. And in some cases, we're reading it means going from 3 meals a day to 2. I don't know what we're going to do, but anyway, people are beginning to look at it.
And what was happening in reality is they're releasing people. California's budget, my home state, is staggering. And so as much as you want to be tough on crime, you can't afford it.
Right.
People getting released. It's a smart decision to say we can save millions and ultimately billions of dollars by reducing our prison population, which is an important step. And none of this is let's be soft on crime or not punish people for these problems. But think of a 16-year-old kid in Washington, D.C. in 1987, when the laws were 100 to 1, who gets a 20-year sentence for selling crack cocaine, not using, or even using crack cocaine. 16 years old in prison until he's 36. No driver's license. The collateral consequences is my point. No driver's license, can't get a job, can't go back to mama's house, has to report and all these other issues, and can't get a job, can't effectively contribute to society. Thank God there are some local people who are saying, you know what, not everyone who commits a crime like selling drugs or even using drugs can be punished for their life. And what we want to do is to restore them, have reentry programs, to make sure they can cut grass, they can paint a building, they can be productive societies, tax-paying, law-abiding citizens. And if we don't give them a job, some kind of job, they're going to be right out there doing the same thing at 36 that they're doing at 16 because they don't have the opportunity to make a difference.
To me, the issue here is not just lowering the budget, but reallocating resources from incarceration to rehabilitation. I don't think that we're spending enough to really rehabilitate them. Many of these people are young people who have made mistakes similar to anyone, but they get trapped in the system, and the system, instead of rehabilitating them, actually makes them worse than they were before. And to your point, we are your rival. Texas is California's rival for the amount of inmates that are incarcerated. We are second in the nation only to California, with about 150,000 inmates or more in the Texas system. From 2000, it's probably even more now. 44,000 employees. We're spending a lot of money just to take care of, maintain, and incarcerate people. We developed a program called the Texas Offenders Reentry Initiative. And what it is designed to do is to catch that inmate when he gets off the bus and help him assimilate back into society. Not only can he not get a job, often doesn't have driver's license, he can't rent a place because many, many places will not rent to people who are incarcerated. In many states, he can't vote again. And yet we say he has paid his debt to society. When all other doors are closed to you, you go back into crime again. And that's why in the state of Texas, 30% of those people who are released end up going back into the criminal system again. They have very few options. And so what we've tried to do is to help them to assimilate back into society, and also help their families to understand that the person coming out is not the same person that went in.
And the question of families, fatherless children, children who have, again, not very many options as they grow up. I mean, this all adds to the cost.
It's a huge disproportionate amount of men and women who are incarcerated who have not had fathers. They didn't have the proper support systems. Sometimes gangs, which is an issue we haven't even talked about, has replaced the notion of family in the absence of a support base for those individuals. And in order to have a sense of family, they go along with the gang. And then they get in prison and have gangs. And they get out and they have no one. And so as a faith-based institution, it doesn't just have to be faith-based, it could be anybody. Somebody has to be waiting when they get off the bus to say, we will take you back. The renters say, we won't take you. The jobs say, we won't take you. Many of them can't even read above a 5th grade level. And so we have to start somewhere. They've been in prison for 10 years. While they're there, we've not really educated them. We've not prepared them to be productive. And so they feel like they have no options.
There's a shocking lack of rehabilitation efforts these days in prisons with criminals, particularly those serving long terms.
Why is that?
I don't know. It's expensive to do, and I think many states think they don't get a good return on their money anyway because the statistics on people who get out and commit crimes again are not encouraging. But if you don't do any rehabilitation while they're there, of course the statistics are apt to be higher. And I think prisons in other countries and Western nations are trying to do much more than we are in terms of rehabilitation. We need to work on that.
Let me ask you about this question of money. One of the huge contributing factors to concerns about the justice system is the relative levels of incarceration of minority people to white people. What about money? Is race more important than money? Is money more important?
I don't understand your question.
Well, if you, I assume that if you have the money, you can afford a better lawyer. You can afford investigators.
Well, maybe, maybe not. I don't think you're talking about a lot of people of high income levels who are getting away with something. We saw one yesterday who just got 150 years, for heaven's sakes. So I don't think that's the argument at all. I think the main thing is whether we're going to do some rehabilitation, whether we're going to stop this long-term mandatory minimum sentencing, and whether we're going to change what we do in the area of drug offenses a little bit.
You know, on a grassroots level, I see it a little bit differently. We've had hands-on experience with people whose children were arrested for a crime who could not afford a lawyer. Things were going very, very negatively. Maybe they can afford a lawyer, can't afford investigation. We got together and put as little as $5,000 toward the case, and the young man ended up being released because it enabled them to do the proper investigation that they needed to get him off the charges. They found out, in fact, he was not guilty. For $5,000 to $10,000 determined the next 25 to 35 years of this young man's life. And so we are starting to see tough laws on crime, especially when the media makes it so highly visible. But beneath the glare of the camera, there are thousands of people who do not get real justice because they don't know who to talk to, they don't know where to go, they're scared of the police, they do not see the criminal justice system as an ally for them, and they shrink back and don't get the proper representation that has been promised to citizens in this country.
What do you do about that?
I don't know what the answer is.
Well, we have a pretty good public defender system, and not all nations have that. I think that's one of the positives, is that in this nation, we've established public defenders in every jurisdiction, and these are highly qualified people for the most part. Let me tell you an experiment I'd like to see tried in this area. I'd like to see some jurisdiction which pays both for public prosecutors, they pay the bill for that, and they pay the bill for public defenders. Have those people change roles every 5 years, and the public prosecutor become a public defender, and vice versa. Believe me, it would work.
Now, there's justice.
I completely embrace the first half of Justice O'Connor's proposal. For this reason, she's right about we have public defenders, but they are very different. There's crisis in the state of Georgia. There's crisis in the state of Louisiana. There's not a very good system in the state of Texas. And so it's a good system when you see a few cases coming up to the court, but in reality, there are a lot of people who don't have lawyers, or don't have lawyers into sometimes weeks, months, sometimes years after they've been detained before they're brought to trial. So we need to address it. I want to say a word about the wonderful work that Tori's doing. When I say Tori, that organization that Pastor Jakes is doing in the Potter's House. It's a great program to meet people on the bus, but the reality is that it's too late. In this respect, and I applaud the mayor of Oakland, Ron Dellums, a former congressman, and the mayor of Newark, Cory Booker, who we've been working with, and getting the mayors to get involved with the corrections officials 6 months before someone's released. Do they have a drug problem? What marketable skills do they have? Where will they be living? Because can you imagine a social service organization trying to solve all those problems? It should be solved as a community issue, because the community wants to know where they're going to live.
Absolutely.
Because a lot of them are homeless.
That's right.
They don't even have a place to live. So it seems to me that mayors, more than governors, at the local level should say, these young men, women, black, white, brown, are being released in December. Let's start planning some things for them. Reverend Earl Sharpton, a former mayor, Ed Koch, and I had this a Second Chance Act to give people a second chance. They went nowhere in the 90s, but there's a second chance law now that has a little bit of merit, but too little money. But the reality is that we've got to see this as a common problem. It's not them and us. It's our community. They're coming back. Whether you like it or not, they're coming back to your neighborhood, to your grocery stores, to your schools, to your churches. And it seems to me you should figure out a way to make sure that they are seamlessly brought back into the community and not become the problems that they've been in the past.
Let's push the envelope on that a little bit. If we can prepare them 6 months in advance, which I think is a wonderful thing to do on a grassroots level, on a small scale, we've been encouraging churches to adopt a prison to help facilitate that process, because in actuality, you cannot begin the relationship with the individual when they get off the bus. It has to start on the inside, or they don't trust you.
That's right.
So that's an issue. But while we're doing that and helping them to get a job and a place to stay, we need to have mandatory testing for HIV/AIDS before they get out.
Right.
We will never be able to fight the ramifications of this disease in our community when we have inmates who have often been forced into sexual situations, come out of prison, do not know their status, and infect their wives, girlfriends, and others because they don't have medical care, they don't have appropriate health care, outside or in. And many times they leave the penal institution not knowing that they are HIV positive, and they're walking around shooting people with a gun every time they have sex, because they don't know who they are, and they're not always going to be responsible and use condoms.
Can I just say one thing about that? A federal judge in Washington, D.C. by the name of Reginald Walton was on a committee that just issued a report about rape in prisons, both children and adults, and talks about the spread of HIV and AIDS as well. And he's a tough prosecutor when he was a prosecutor, a tough judge. He'll give you a fair trial, but if you win, congratulations. If you lose, you're going to be there for the rest of your life, right? So, but the idea was, his point is that there are a lot of people here who are victims of collateral consequences of their crimes. They're going to prison, they're raped, they're abused, they're contract this disease. And it seems to me that we have a societal goal of making sure that no one is released without having the people don't want to talk about it. You can't even talk about it publicly. There's, particularly in the black community, there's this reluctance to say, I have a disease, particularly among black males, even if it's forced upon you. And I think some way of addressing that in a societal way is very important.
Well, we're not realistic. Many of those young black men that are incarcerated are teenagers. They're young men. Can you imagine being 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 22, 24 in a prison institution and an environment? They're not going to talk about what happened to them because of their fears and homophobia and so forth and so on. And they're going to come out and try to prove that they're okay by having as many women as possible. And now we have a crisis in our community where black women are disproportionately infecting a disease. And the penal system is contributing to that, because we won't spend the dollars to have them tested ahead of time. We end up spending many more dollars as we treat the whole family as they are dying of AIDS.
Now, something which is a sort of a related issue, I guess, is the question of young people in prison who are there because they had some sort of gang association and were tried as adults. Does that need to be changed? Do we need to make some sort of, would it serve the course of justice if somehow we were to change the laws that govern when a person can be tried as an adult?
Well, that's going to be hard to do. If you can be tried at age 18, which is the age you get to vote, I think it's going to be awfully hard to get that changed. If you're old enough to vote, you're old enough to understand not to commit a crime. I think that's a long shot. I think we got to work on some of these other things first, to tell you the truth.
But I think it's not the 18-year-old that I'm worried about. It's the 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds who are prosecuted and spend time in adult prisons because they're treated.
But what percentage of those are prosecuted as adults? Not many.
It's
very few.
It's actually quite a substantial number. It has changed since local jurisdictions have said. The old idea is that before you could be treated as an adult, there was a waiver process that the government had to show that you were no longer able to be rehabilitated in the juvenile system. All that's gone. So there are statutes now. Again, it's legislative statutes saying that if you commit certain crimes, murder, rape, robbery, kidnapping, certain drug offenses, that you can automatically be transferred to the adult court, which is problematic for this reason. Laws against gangs make sense, but laws against everyone who's young, who wears the same clothes or lives in the same neighborhood, that's the overreach was the problem. And that's what our report's about. No More Children Left Behind bars would say, if we did rehabilitation, if we did intervention, prevention, we could keep these kids out of the adult system. And in fact, Congressman Bobby Scott has introduced the Youth Promise Act with the whole idea is that punish the serious gang members, to the fullest extent of the law, but those who are not in that category should be treated and rehabilitated in some meaningful ways. That has, I think, 220 now endorsers in Congress and will probably be passed this fall. But that kind of prevention and recognizing the difference between a gangbanger and a kid. And here's the real issue. We keep talking about trying to intervene with kids when they're 15. It's too late. If we don't look at 9 to 13-year-olds, those are the kids who are in 4th and 5th grade, and their mentors come with me. I'll give you some money. I'll give you shelter. I'll give you protection. We don't have a community out there with these kids who are in middle school, who are before high school, who are recruited by gangs because there's no one else in the community. There's no one at home at 3 to 6. So they're on the streets. We focus about curfews at 9 o'clock. It's happening between 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock when there are no parents at home. The kids are running around the community. And if we want to really think smart about crime, we'll think about ways of making sure those 9 to 13-year-olds have something to do other than hang on the streets and have someone recruit them into the gangs.
Let me change the subject to something that I suppose is related to everything we've been talking about, but the jury system. Is the jury system meting out justice? Does the jury system work?
Well, I
Justice
think
O'Connor?
it does. I sat as a trial judge in many criminal cases for some years, and I had many cases go to a jury. And I only remember 2 or possibly 3 in all those years where I thought the jury just plain got it wrong. I think they've been very responsible in meeting their obligations. I've been impressed with it. Maybe it depends in part on having a judge in the courtroom that carefully instructs the jury and makes them understand their role. But I think it can be very effective, and in my experience is.
Do you think that juries appreciate the lack of discretion that a judge has in sentencing?
No, because they're told, don't consider the sentence. Your job is to determine the facts, guilt or innocence. You are not to consider the potential sentence. They're told not to.
Well, I grant you that I have a movie of the week view of this, but there are one gets the impression that jury nullification is the only thing that really stands between defendants whose guilt may be.
I don't agree at all. Now, there are some death penalty cases where the sentence then goes back to the jury after there's a determination of guilt or innocence. Then most states have enacted a role for the jury in the sentencing at that level to make sure that it's not arbitrarily imposed by a judge. But really, I think the jury system functions fairly well.
I think it depends where you sit. I mean, Justice O'Connor sitting as a trial judge, she controls the system, and it works, right, when you're a judge, because she can monitor efforts by prosecutors to remove jurors on a basis other than the merits of the case, and control the evidence as it comes through to make sure it's constitutional evidence. That's important. That's not where the problems exist. It's the problems that are invisible that the court never sees. Now, we've got a remarkable problem now that has nothing to do with race or gender or class. It's these tweeting, blogging, texting jurors who want to figure out for themselves, why is this person charged? What do we know about it? Let me do my own research. And you only find out about that after the fact, because judges can give instructions, but you don't know what they're doing after 5 o'clock when they go home. And it's not regional. It's not the South or the North. Around the country, more and more jurors say, well, let me see what this guy's really about. Let me talk about this company. That's a frightening idea that jurors are taking upon themselves the idea to figure out what the case is really about.
Of course, a competent trial judge takes care of that. I always did. You can't read the newspaper. You can't do anything else to find out the facts of this while you're sitting as this jury.
But
They hear that, they don't follow it,
Well-
right? Because no one's going home with them. There were 9 jurors in one case on a chat going back and forth about the evidence that day. You know, well, I didn't think, well, et cetera. And you can't discover, because people will say, they would never tell you, well, I'm just blogging, right? But that's what they're doing, and that undermines the system from both sides. Both sides. The race problem is that we have virtually eliminated, but not yet. There still are prosecutors who believe the zeal to win is more important to achieve justice. And that's wrong, because you want to win because you want to put a bad guy or girl behind bars. But the reality is that when you start striking people because of your assumptions about their race or their gender or their ethnicity, that is very problematic. I had one case before the Supreme Court in 1990, James Ford, an African American, who killed a very prominent white woman in Georgia, and he was convicted and sentenced to death, but the prosecutor had struck the black jurors. And the Supreme Court looked at that case. It was, I think, Justice Souter's first opinion, and he wrote an opinion reversing that death sentence, saying that, you know, there's certain things we can't do. And the same thing with the case of Thomas L., the case in Texas, where the evidence is pretty strong from the government's point of view, but you can't continue to exercise practices to convict somebody if the process is not right. So the case keeps coming back because it's not whether the person is guilty, but whether or not the procedures have been followed. And that's one of the jury systems. When I thank the court for, let's look at this and look back that the prosecutor followed their laws. And maybe the fact that they're reprimanding a few prosecutors is making them think more carefully about what they're doing.
It is a frightening thought to me. I think everything is changing so much with the deluge of information we have today. It's no longer limited to the newspaper or watching the 6 o'clock news. You can independently, while you're sitting here right now, send out information and get information, whether it be accurate, and this is what really scares me, whether it be accurate or inaccurate. There are no laws or guidelines to control these blog sites and this Twittering and what have you. And it's a really scary thing today to really control, particularly when it relates to the judicial system.
We've had a few trials that have been stopped because the judge has, somebody has told the judge that they got a tweet from a juror, and it was during the course of the trial. It had not been very many, but it does make you kind of wonder, if you know about this many, how many do you not know about?
Well, you don't know about the ones who say, oh my God, I better go underground and not let this be seen. That's the fear. There's no way of really controlling it. If people are going to be asked every day, did you read anything, hear anything that might affect your evidence? The person would say, no. She didn't ask me whether I tweeted, so I'm fine. Whether I blogged, right? I sent something, I didn't read anything. But there's a flaw in the system that has to be addressed. And I think it's going to require changing the jury instructions to admonish it that you can't tweet, you can't blog, you can't discuss at any level, in any way, electronically or otherwise. And they know it, but they do it anyway because they probably won't get caught. Right.
One of the things that has happened recently in terms of prosecutions is that, and prison populations, is that the population of young women appears to be going up.
In prison?
Yes. Now, why is that? And is what do we think about that?
Well, we think women can do all kinds of things. I guess they can commit crimes too. And if they do, they ought to get caught. I don't think that's a negative, that there are more women in prison. If they're more using drugs or doing whatever it is, they need to suffer the consequences too, I suppose.
It's certainly not a negative, but it is a very complicated issue because there's a disproportionate amount of women who are incarcerated as a resulting from domestic violence and abuse. And it opens up...
Now, there is a big issue to talk about.
Absolutely.
Domestic violence. We can talk about that. And this is huge.
Which incidentally is going up during this recession in alarming rates. And then what complicates it and exacerbates the problem even more is this whole thing of women being pregnant in prison or having given birth in prison. These are issues that men don't have to deal with. And the abandonment of the mother from the home does complicate it. It's not really an equal playing field. And so when you see women incarcerated, it opens up a plethora of issues that men don't have to deal with. And I think that we're going to see scars in the family for many, many generations to come.
Well, and one of the problems is the problem of status crimes. There are women who are sex workers who are prosecuted and sent to prison, and you rarely ever prosecute either the pimps or the Johns, right? Mm-hmm. They're not visible. They're not part of the system. And it becomes a revolving door in terms of the problems of HIV/AIDS. I have to say, a judge from Texas, Vanessa Gilmore, is a federal judge, an African-American woman who has to sentence people to long periods of time. And what she did with another woman was come up with a coloring book for those children who were sitting in the courtroom and seeing their mothers or fathers going to jail for 20 years, to let them deal with the trauma. And what she does, she teaches the children how to write and continue a relationship. Don't break the family bond. Teaching the people who are sentenced to have a continuing relationship, even if they're in prison. The fact that the family continues. Now, that's one judge trying to do something. She can't reduce the sentence. She can't give probation. She has to follow the guidelines. But she can do something else that she thinks might affect this child's ability to not be the recidivist, to follow in the footsteps of mother or father and do the very same thing. And the same thing with girls. The 9 to 13-year-olds are very vulnerable on the streets, the same problems. If we don't come up with prevention programs, they will find themselves in the system, and they will look just like everybody else. They've got a drug problem, they've got a truancy problem, they've got a behavior problem, but the problem started from being molested as an infant, being abused as a teenager, being sexually assaulted as a young woman, and then you see the robbery, the drug use, etc. But it doesn't start, because one thing that's remarkable is that there is a remarkable class connection to crime. You don't see a lot of rich people, except Madoff, who are really going to jail, are being prosecuted. And so there is this real class race issue that is prevalent, and if we really are concerned about it, we'll find some ways to reduce it. Let me just say this. We're talking to a largely white male and female audience. I say this every time I go somewhere to speak. You are part of the mentors that can make a difference. The folks in the system may not live in your community, you may not see them, but you can't think that mentorship is either racially or gender-based. There are people who have the skills, the ability, and the means who can make an enormous difference. So don't count yourselves out simply because you live in a different place or work in a different place or worship in a different place. You have the skills, the ability, and the compassion, I hope, to solve the problem. Don't wait for someone else to do it, because it's a societal problem and everybody has to take a role in it.
Now, I'm going to count that as an idea that works.
Yes.
Because we're supposed to talk about that during the course of this conversation. Justice O'Connor, I wonder what you think is an idea that would work in terms of forwarding the cause of justice in the American criminal justice
Well, I
system.
like the notion of getting people involved as mentors or helpers to people who are incarcerated. I know a number of women in my home state of Arizona who are involved in a program to try to help women and women who are incarcerated, and women who have families in particular. And they make contact with them while they're still in prison and try to strengthen bonds there, and then try to help when they're released. And I applaud programs of that kind. You can do it as a volunteer.
You've talked, Bishop Jakes, about how in your community you're trying to receive the released prisoners and set them on another path. But you also have programs, and I wonder, if you think any of these are particularly worth passing on for trying to reach out to people before they get there.
Oh, I think it's imperative. I mean, one of the things on the table, and I'm so glad for what you said about mentoring and not being intimidated by mentoring somebody who's very different in color or gender from you, we're getting ready to do a program called Fishers of Men. Because most young boys, in fact, adult men in our community have never been fishing in their life. Their world is so small. Their exposure is so limited. And so the people who are making decisions about them, about what they should do and ought to do, actually live in two different worlds altogether. My church is 44% men. So out of 30,000.
That would be high, it seems to me.
It's unusually high. And we just came out of a men's conference before I came here. The ratio of men in my church who have never been fishing are amazingly high because they didn't have fathers to take them fishing. So they could be 40 years old and have never held a fishing rod in their life. We're sharing the same planet, we're breathing the same air, but we're having a totally different experience. So the things that they do that are activity-oriented are limited by budget, by experience, by exposure, and by family. We have to get to the point in this country that we cross-pollinate beyond race and language, and we bring each other into the same world of opportunities. In so doing, we can cause those young people to dream and hope for a better day. And I also want to mention this, and I know it may be slightly political and a little controversial, but we also have an obligation as people in the media to bring before the faces of young Black and Hispanic children heroes and people to admire that look like them. And this current president that we have now has changed the topography of how young people now have somebody to admire. We've got to make it smart. We've got to make it cool to be smart. And they can't do that for themselves. The people in this room and others are the ones who make decisions of the images they see on screen. And when they see images of people who look like them, who are applauded for positive things, it gives them something to aspire to, and then give them the tools of education and the exposure of the commitment of time. That mentoring makes things work. And that's some of the things that we're developing with the Fishers of Men.
That's good. Now it's your turn. There in the back, there are microphones that are wandering around the room. You stand up and indicate that you want one of the microphones. We'll get one to you.
Hi, my name's Nate Lowenthal. Thanks for that terrific presentation. A couple of you mentioned some kind of how we can think through the problem and the economic costs of it, so that prisons are incredibly expensive, so we might have to cut back on prison populations, and that if we don't test for HIV ahead of time, we end up paying the cost later. So, and I'm wondering what you think is the most effective political messaging for how to confront this problem. Is it talking about it in economic terms? So we just can't afford to keep this many people in prison. We need to be investing in their education because it'll yield long-term economic benefits. Or is it more about talking about it in terms of justice and values? And which is a more kind of potent political message right now, and why?
So,
Well, if it's in a state legislature, you jolly well better talk dollars and cents, because they're trying to meet a budget. So it's smart in that circumstance to talk in terms of what it does to the budget and the economy.
Whereas as it relates to the voters, I think you have to talk about it from a moral responsibility, because they're not going to be as moved by the economy of it as they are going to be the human compassion of it. So I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both, depending on the circle that you're talking to, what they care about the most.
That's going to be my point. It's not either or, but both and, because when you talk about just punishment, you're talking about the economics, but you're also talking about, making sure that someone pays their debt to society. California is a classic example. They're not releasing people because they're soft on crime. They're releasing people because they can't afford to continue to pay the cost of incarcerating people who are not a threat anymore and who can be more productive making money, because otherwise they're going to be on the state's rolls because they don't have income. So that's a very important step in the right direction.
My fear, I just want to interject this, my fear is that we don't do what we did with the mental health system. To cut the budgets, we released them and they became homeless people. Right. And we have countless amounts of people who were once, who need mental health care, who are walking around our streets today and either are unjustly treated or sometimes victimize themselves or victimizing us. So we as my mother would say, you cut off your nose to spite your face. So we have to make a wide sensitivity as to what we're going to do going forward in the penal system.
right down here in front. This is going to set a track record here, get all the way down to the front.
This is
No, you're on.
You're on.
this is probably a very naive question, but when you talk about 6 months before they're released, you want to check and see if they have HIV. Would it be impossible to check HIV as they come in and segregate the HIV from the others? I'm sure the prisons are not built to do that, but would there be a means to do that so that it doesn't spread to the whole population?
Well, you understand.
Well, this would require an essay that's too long to give now about privacy interests, and et cetera. But the correction officials have a lot of authority. They actually quarantine people when they come to prison anyway, because you don't know whether they might have a variety of other transmittable diseases, not HIV and AIDS, but a whole series of diseases that need to be addressed. So they can do that if they want to do it, and it wouldn't increase the cost because everyone is given a test when they arrive. When you say isolate, you've got to be, people who have HIV and AIDS still can be productive members of the community. We can't, in a sense, stigmatize them. They can work, they can be involved in everything else. When I say they, it's us.
Particularly if
right?
they're being treated.
Absolutely, and that's important that they have a normal life. What you're concerned about is the spread, so the treatment is very important as well. The 6 months is just to make sure that if they ignore it during the time that they're there, it's a big problem. And I think the report that Judge Walton and his committee came up with is a blueprint for how we can address this issue, and I hope that it will be adopted by Congress very soon.
Footnote, what I was hoping for is not just segregating so that they don't spread it. I am a strong advocate for testing as they go back into society so that they have knowledge, not to their isolation. If you don't know your status, you could innocently damage somebody you love, and they die because you love them, or they're sick because you love them. And so what I'm saying is those people need to know. Not so much so that they're segregated, but so that they can modify their behavior according to the situation that they're in.
One little point there as well, to his credit, I had the honor of mentoring both President Obama and his wife, Michelle Obama, when they were at Harvard. And he said something a week ago, just this last week, that's sorely been ignored. His point that everybody should be tested for HIV and AIDS. He said, oh, I'm not. He said, everybody. Why? It eliminates the stigma. That's what they've done in South Africa and other places, that if everyone has to do it in a school, you're not isolating the 7 or 8 people. Said, aha, those are the ones to stay away from. The stigmatization is very, very powerful in the black community, whether it's here in Haiti or in Jamaica or anywhere in the world. And so the more that we can make this a routine medical checkup, everyone gets a medical checkup privately, the better off the healthcare professionals will be in addressing these issues.
Justice O'Connor and I are the only ones up here who remember when everyone was tested for TB.
Right.
The patch test.
Right.
No, you're not the only ones who remember that.
I beg your pardon. Okay, right there. Yes.
Can I go ahead?
You have the microphone? I hear someone.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Here it
In the back.
comes, here it
The back.
comes.
And those in the back already.
Thank you for this. One clarification and then a question. Going back to the discussion of rehabilitation while incarcerated and education in prison, my understanding of the research is that actually recidivism rates, so return on investment of prisons that provided associate's and bachelor's degrees, particularly looking at New York before they suspended that programming, was extraordinarily successful. So I'd like to get some clarification if that data is wrong. The second thing is I wonder if we could go into the fray a little bit more on modification of drug sentencing, drug policy, and even legalization, if we could hear your thoughts on what we actually do, since clearly that's the crux of so much of this. Thank
I'll
you.
answer the first, and then we can talk about the second one, but you are absolutely right about the value of having people focused on something aspirational. If you go to school and you can get a degree in prison, you can get out and get a job. Lorton Prison, which the Justice knows about, which was in Virginia, and there were thousands of DC inmates who were sentenced, and they got an education, an AA, and some a BA, some an MA, some a PhD. And it just changed their lives. You don't know what studying and getting a degree, 20 years, what a difference will make when you were 17 when you went in, 37 you're ready to work somewhere. But our tough on crime law said, well, we can't have schools, we can't have libraries, we can't have education. That was the first thing to go. And I think it had a collateral consequence of denying people the opportunities to studies. But the studies have shown that those people who have an education, we know that's simple, are less likely to be recidivists. Because they can do something that allows them to be, again, tax-paying, wage-earning citizens, which is the exception.
Justice O'Connor, do you want to speak to the question of what needs to be changed about the way we sentence drug offenders?
Well, Congress has, and legislative bodies have to look at the mandatory minimum sentencing laws, see what it's done to the prison population, and whether they think it's worked or whether they should reduce that and make it much more flexible as it used to be in the olden days. I think that's the number one thing they need to do.
And you think restoring discretion to judges would be the
At
right-
some level, get rid of mandatory minimums for certain crimes and restore more flexibility in sentencing.
And let me just say this, it's not even restoring it. Justice Breyer last week spoke before a congressional group, and his point was that they have the ability to depart, right? And it's there. All cases aren't the same. Right. And judges have been intimidated by being reversed once or remanded once, so they don't say, this is a different case from the other Smith, Jones, and Williams cases, and therefore I'm going to depart. And he also said, he said, I can't tell a legislature what to do, but mandatory minimums make no sense because they're automatic, you can't touch them. And so there is room to think about judges being independent.
He was probably talking about the federal sentencing
Right.
scheme,
But
and
states
that's
are
only
adopting
a
them too.
minority of
Right.
the crimes. Every state, it's the states that handle the bulk of the crime,
Right.
and every state needs to take a look, frankly.
Now, Bishop Jakes, you were talking earlier about the difference between powder cocaine and crack cocaine, where one is sentenced with a far longer term than the other.
Yes, and it's a matter of money here. One is far more expensive than the other, and it's also about race because one is predominantly used by minorities than the other, but the substance in essence is basically the same thing. To find out that they are working now to bring some equity between that is very encouraging for me because I think it was unfair in the first place. It didn't work. It didn't deter. It's been ineffective in rehabilitating people, and so we need to reevaluate that and bring about a more balanced sense of justice. But I wanted to interject something quickly too. If the person goes, if we do rehabilitate them while they're incarcerated and they do get the degrees or the skills, it doesn't even have to be education. It may be some sort of trade or skill that makes them marketable in the job market. Then you can have a skill and still not have a job. We have to do some sort of tax incentive for business owners to give second chances to people who do have skills and opportunities. Right now, they don't really benefit appropriately, and there's nothing that the government is doing to encourage them. So I'm saying the tax incentive would pay itself off rather than the person ending up back in the penal system again.
Particularly now in this economic situation, jobs are really hard to get.
Right.
So why would an employer pick a recent prison inmate over somebody else who's had a clean record when jobs are scarce? If with a tax incentive, they might.
It might help.
Might.
We haven't talked at all about private prisons and the extent to which the budgeting, the sort of lowest bid prison affects.
But it isn't a lot less than what it costs the state to run it. It's not an economic factor. And we haven't seen a lot of success with them anyway.
Okay, now there's a man with a microphone.
I'm Dan Sharp. One of the interesting new ideas that I heard from your panel is that all of us should consider being mentors to prisoners. I'd like to hear you speak a little more about it because I can't imagine many of us would know how to make the appropriate contact, what kinds of things to think about so that we are more constructive than negative. Could you expand on that so that it might happen?
I'll happily do that. The prison mentoring, to me, is the last resort. The real mentoring is kids who are in elementary school, middle school, starting early. The prevention rather than the treatment is my point. I'm not against prison. I think that's important. And you started by, there are, wherever you live, there still are public schools. And the reality is that an A at a public school is different from an A at a private school. Right? We think they're the same. They're not the same. Because one has a wet lab, one has a band, one does field trips, one has honors courses, and et cetera. And so looking at public schools that may be 28 miles away from where you live, but saying, I'd like to volunteer that once a month we'll take 20 8th graders, 6th graders to one of the museums. There will be kids who live people in Washington, D.C. have never been to the White House. They've never been to the Air and Space Museum. I mean, they don't have to go to France to see Monet. The idea of saying, let me do something to help children appreciate the fact that this is for them too. And that, how did you get there? Well, even a painter, it takes discipline, it takes practice, mistake and error, it takes mentoring. All those, the learning skills are pretty significant. I'll be happy to direct you if you tell me where you're from. We can do that. But the reality, the opinions are there. Let me tell you one of the things that troubles me the most. The reason I'm here today two parents who never finished high school, one from Alabama, one from Arkansas, my mother and father. But the reality is that they made sure that I went to the library. Maybe that was my babysitter, but I was there reading books and learning. And now the libraries have shorter hours than any other institution in the community. Think about your own community when a kid can't walk into a library at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning and stay until they kick you out at 7 o'clock Saturday night. They're not even open on Saturdays in many places. So that's the kind of thing. If a kid can't they don't have computers in homes, if they can't access self-learning institutions, that's a problem. So getting someone exposed to a library that it's fun, it's interesting, it's exciting, is the kind of thing that makes an enormous amount of difference that everyone can do.
And there's some great programs in
Absolutely.
many states and communities where you can say, okay, I'll offer to maintain contact over a period of several years with a youngster who is very likely going to be in trouble if I don't, because the father is in prison or the mother's in prison or something's already happened. And you can be that contact that can see them through. I've seen remarkable results from that.
Can I just say a word about soccer? Both of my kids played soccer when they were kids in Cambridge, because they wanted them to be a part of the community. And I look at the same soccer fields now, and I don't see any children of color, women or men, boys or girls. Why? Because now, even if it's a $100 entry fee, which seems small, there are parents who are too embarrassed to say, I can't afford it. They're saying, well, let's do something else on Saturday. Next time you go out to see your grandchild or children on the look around the soccer fields, look around. It's the most universal sport in the world.
Yes, great.
But think about whether or not, where are the kids who you know live in your same community but aren't there? Don't think that they don't like soccer. Kids like to run, they like to kick. They like the snacks. They really love the snacks. So that's one of the equalizers, something that seems trivial, how to think about getting other children involved in something that's teamwork, unity, supporting each other, learning leadership. All these qualities will help them in school. And I'm hoping that's something that you might want to do.
To your point, I think that there's a certain degree of intimidation when you cross color barriers, sociological, economical barriers. There's a fear of rejection, and we all have it. And to deter that, sports can be a common denominator. Something that you're interested in, that they're interested in, that is non-threatening to either of you. Because many, many times people really do want to help, but they're intimidated, and we have a strong fear of rejection, so we don't bother them. And consequently, the child is not exposed to many things that you call normal. And you say, how could this child end up like this? We live in the same city. Not really. Not really. You're not living, you're breathing the same air, but you're having a totally different experience. So bringing them into those atmospheres, music is a huge tool where you can be in a non-threatening environment, and it's about the music and you don't feel rejection. Bringing diverse kids together, not just one, but different people, somebody that helps you relate to the child, and sponsoring kids to go to events that are culturally sensitive. There's all kinds of things that we could do to live together more effectively.
Now, this is a man who has, I think he's the only minister I've ever heard of who has a dance ministry. Let's see, somewhere around in here, yes. No, that's you, yes, you.
You just need the microphone. It's just coming your way.
Needs a mic.
Okay.
My question goes to juvenile rehabilitation. The woman back there mentioning that there was a program in New York and how successful it is and the problem of funding.
Canceled.
And I really want to talk about an alternative institutionalization that we see in the public schools, arising in the public schools, and its application to juvenile rehabilitation in the criminal justice system. And what I mean by that is we have a totally dysfunctional, by and large, public school system, and you have a new idea called charter schools or all of the various methodologies of intervening to create alternative institutional benefits and funding as a challenge to an existing system. So I'm saying in the juvenile justice system, if Bishop Jakes, when a kid was going to go off to prison, and we know that it's $7,000 a year, that he says, and I'm challenging you, you say, look, within that sentencing, we have a charter school. Rather than spending $7,000 a year in the prison or in the juvenile correction system, we'll take 50 kids in the charter school that the prison system would otherwise have, and we begin to explain to legislatures, look how much more successful it is. So
Good.
my question is, would you advocate to a legislature a system like charter schools in the juvenile justice system?
This sounds a lot like when I was a child in New Mexico. The judge had the discretion to tell the parents it's going to be juvenile justice, into the juvenile justice system or New Mexico Military Academy.
To his point, I think it's a good idea. I think it's a viable option. And this is a controversial issue, but it's similar to the idea of vouchers, where parents have an opportunity to choose where they send their kids, not only because of something illegal that they've done, but to get outside of the prison of some of the public systems. Dallas school systems are getting better, but it has been a wasteland. And many, many times people are trapped, almost like Katrina. They're trapped in a system that does not allow them, over a small amount of money, to get their children out, even if you can't get the parents out. And you also have to understand the importance of faith-based initiatives, not just for the strength of the faith itself, whether you embrace it or don't, but to understand in different cultures, the church means different things in different cultures. And the church is more than about religion, it's more than about faith, though we're not ashamed of those primary goals. It's also about being the hub of our community. And to ignore it, you have alienated the entire or a major part of our community, because people will come to the church, they won't come to counseling. They'll come to the church. They won't open up to you. And so you have to learn how to speak in the language of the community you seek to save.
Okay, last question comes in the right straight ahead of me, wearing orange, it looks like. Oh, she's going to get there. We could always throw it at you, which probably wouldn't be a good idea.
Hi,
Probably
thank you.
not.
This was so stimulating, so many ideas. And I'm just wondering if you sort of touched on this, creative solutions to rehabbing people when they come out and providing jobs for them. And Dr. Ogletree, you probably know Van Jones, and I'm just wondering if there's any kind of stimulus money at the federal level being invested in programs that link issues, solutions to various issues, such as, creating green jobs. Why can't there be money put into programs to train these people getting out of prison to install solar and learn about wind generation, et cetera, et cetera? And it just seems like it's a no-brainer, and we just have to be creative about hitting these issues all together in a way.
You want to
It's
respond?
a very good point. And in fact, people who don't know Van Jones, an African-American who graduated from Yale Law School, who was in Oakland and created this idea of green jobs. He spoke at Tavis Smiley State of the Black Union in February, saying that green jobs are the future way for the poor urban community to respond, because it means that you're a safer, healthier environment. You can do that. President Obama was listening. Now, Van Jones has left Oakland. He's now in Washington, working in the administration, using green jobs as a universal federal effort as part of the stimulus bill to talk about getting people to work. Now, who are they employing? We employed skilled workers, semi-skilled workers, and unskilled workers. Who are the unskilled workers? The folks who were in prison, who couldn't get the job, or who had a barrier to admission. And so the whole idea is that the stimulus package is designed to do that. And green jobs helps everybody. And I think Van Jones' work was very important as a stimulus, and the president recognized that. That's why he's out there now making sure this becomes an issue to make our environment. We won't have these plastic bottles anymore, right? We'll have many more sort of environmentally conscious efforts to address these issues, and it reaches that very community that you described. Thanks for raising it.
And I think that's it. Thank you all very much.
Okay. No, now we need to